Hi everybody, also a warm welcome from my side. My name is Stefan, I'm a postdoctoral researcher here in Regensburg. I'm also part of the University of the Bundeswehr in Munich, and I'm doing here some basic research with TEPs, but I'm also doing some more clinical related research with tinnitus, for example. And today I want to show you our first TEP experiment we conducted here in Regensburg, which is about the online EEG effects during a 1 Hz ARTEMIS application. And is the clicker working?
I do hope so. Maybe. Yeah, we're seeing. No, the clicker. Maybe I just remove it and plug it in again.
So I will use the keyboard also.
That's I can. Yeah.
Yeah, perfect. So as you all know, TEPs provide a direct readout for cortical dynamics, and that's where they also use to assess the neuroplastic effects of ARTEMIS. For example, we've shown that the P60 or the N100 increased after 1 Hz ARTEMIS over the healthy motor cortex, or for example, in a more clinical related context, that the N45 and the N100 decreased after high frequency ARTEMIS in patients with depression when you stimulate over the prefrontal cortex. But what's actually happening in the brain while we stimulate is more or less a black box up to now, but it could give us some very informative insights. For example, how much pulses are needed until an effect takes place, or for example, is after a certain amount of pulses an effect plateau reached, for example, or is there even an effect reversal happening? And that's what we wanted to analyze with this first experiment here. So first we wanted to check if it is feasible to analyze TMS-evoked EEG activity during 1 Hz ARTEMIS, and then we wanted to analyze the temporal change over time with the amount of given pulses, for example. And this we investigated. So it is also not working right now. Maybe I used the keyboard, or maybe let the presentation be active, then it's working.
Yeah, it should be.
So we investigated 11 healthy subjects in a standard clinical setting, which means that we did not use any neuronavigation or any coil to assist us with coil placement. We simply defined the resting motor threshold according to Rossini without EEG cap and with mounted EEG cap. And once we had the individual motor hotspot, we just placed the coil with such a coil holder, as you can see here, and stimulated with 1,000 Hz over the individual motor hotspot. And while we stimulated, the subjects were requested to focus on a fixation cross, as you can see here. And while we stimulated, we also applied some TMS click masking. We used the TAC toolbox to create a stimuli which has a ratio of 70% of white noise and 30% of the specific TMS click of our McVenture machine. And we also recorded EEG during the stimulation, and also EMG of the right hand from the FDI muscle. And we did actually use an active cold figure of echo. This is just for illustration where we approximately stimulated. And here you can see our EMG placement. And now I want to show you a little bit how we pre-processed our EEG. So we used the TESO toolbox. We also followed their guidelines. Before we started, we defined our window of the TMS artifact, which is a little bit broader than it's actually written down in the literature, but I think it's okay once you define it or identify it before you start with the pre-processing. And we also epoch the data, of course, with respect to the intervals we have of 1 second. So 1 pulse was 1 trial. In total, we had 1,000 trials per subject. And we applied 2 ICAs, one for removal of the TMS effect, as I told you yesterday, Leo, and the other one just to simply get rid of all the other artifacts we know when we are working with EEG recordings. And we also did final validation in field trip when we were finished with the TESA pre-processing. We also checked each trial, so all the 1,000 trials, or how much of them were left in the data browser again per subject. Also the average activity was checked by us with single plots and topo plots, and we also did some source localization on the individual subject level with a minimum norm estimation to check if none of the activity of interest is source localized in any auditory cortical areas, for example. And we had to exclude actually 1 subject because of noisy data, and in total we had 800 artifact-free trials for our analysis. And yeah, this already brings me to the first aim of the study. Is it feasible to analyze TEPs or TMS-evoked EEG activity during 1 Hz ARTEMIS? And here you can see the average activity of this region of interest. For example, we see this typical TEP components on average, but you also see that in gray lines that individual subject responses are pretty different, for example, and Here you can also see the topos. Of course, the color bar is adapted so we can compare all the components. We see that we have a direct activation for the N15 component under the coil, where we approximately stimulated the P30 peaks over central areas and the N45 peaks over more contralateral areas. And this pattern of activation is also described in the review paper from Tremblay 2019. So in our opinion, this seems like this is working, of course, and we also wanted to be sure we also applied source localization for all the components to check where they are localized. And you can see here, for example, that the N45 is localized in the left primary motor, sensory cortex and also in the left primary motor cortex. And we also know that the N45 is related to sensory activation. This is actually directly or spot on the area where the Fröhlich paper said that it's related to a peripheral movement of the right hand, for example. We also see that the P30, which peaked over more central areas in the total clocks, is also more localized centrally. And in case of the N45, which has a peak negative activity on contralateral areas, there's also source activity on the right side, but the main activity is still localized here on the left cortical areas, for example. So actually, in our opinion, it seems like it's possible to do this. And this brings me to the next question. Does Team SEG Team SEG brain activity change over time? For this, we did simply a TP extraction. We used the peaks of our it's not working because of the screen. We used the peaks of the average activity, then defined a time window around it, and within this time window, we searched for each trial per subject for the peak. So all the 1,000 trials, or 800 trials per subject, identified a peak within this time window per trial. And then we exported a specific time window or the average activity of a specific time window around the peak for our statistical analysis. And we also were interested in a more global measure of cortical excitability, the low need field potential, just for the time window from the M15 to the P60, and also more, and also then the local need field potential with our region of interest where we extracted the TP components. Yes, so now I want to show you how we did the first statistical analysis. We decided to use linear mixed effect model fitting. We created 10 blocks, 80 trials. We fitted several different models, like the only intercept model and the model also with a random effect. So we're assuming that the intercept is different between subjects. We also added a fixed effect of block, which we tested with likelihood ratio tests, different models to see if we have, for example, a significant effect of block. And if there was one, we decided to do some post-hoc contrast, of course, to see where the differences between the blocks are. And we also wanted to do it a little bit more sophisticated, let's say, for all the trials we had. So for 800 trials, we applied some growth model fitting with the same structure as you can see here, but we also decided to add a random slope because we're assuming that trials differ between the subjects. And we're also assuming that trials which are closely related in time to each other are highly correlated. So we also decided to account for this and model first order autoregressive covariance structure into the model again. And of course, model effects or changes of the amplitudes over time should not only be linear, they can also be cubic or quadratic. That's why we also accounted for this and also check this in our model fitting approach, which model has the best fit for the data, or which best describes the data. Yeah. So I want to show you some preliminary results. So here you can see the time course. Okay, there are no individual plots here. Normally they're just simple dots here, which represent the actual activation. So here it's just the average activity. I don't know why the plot is not working here. No problem. You see that the N15, for example, gets over time. So after 400 to 500 pulses, the N15 gets more positive, and then it goes back to a normal state, and state which was actually the same like when we started with the stimulation. We see a quadratic trend here with a significant effect of trials. So the N15 amplitude changes over time. You can also see this here via our linear mixed effect model fitting that, for example, block number 4 and block number 6 are significant different to the first and the last block, for example. This also speaks for a quadratic trend. And we also see the same pattern here for the P30. The P30 amplitude increases slightly. We also have a quadratic trend here. We have the highest amplitude after 400 to 500 pulses, as you can see here, for example, and this type of activation or this type of change is also present for the N.5, for example. The negative amplitude gets more positive after 400 to 500 pulses, and then it goes back up again, but it's not that high anymore like at the beginning of stimulation. We see the same pattern also for the P60. Here you can see that there's more or less a little bit of a plateau reached, for example, and for the N100, we see that the amplitude gets more negative, so it gets up. It also has a quadratic trend. Maybe this is related to block 5, for example, where the amplitude, the negative amplitude decreased a little bit. And we were also interested in a more global measure of cortical excitability, the global mean field potential. We also see change over time, and as you can see here, at the end of stimulation, the level of cortical excitability is the highest in contrast to the start of the stimulation. It's also present for our region of interest with the local mean field potential. So we see that TP components change over time, and we also know that individual subjects have different responses. Each brain is different. That's why we also used individual linear mixed effect model fitting. So we get rid of, for example, the random slopes and so on, which are not useful here. And we see that we mostly have a quadratic trend, which is also present in the average data, but we also see people who have no trend, a linear trend, also no effect, and there's even a subject which shows a cubic trend, so the amplitude goes down, then it goes up again, and then it goes down, for example. So we have individual responses and changes over time, and this is also the same for our region of interest. So what's the take-home message of my presentation today? So it's feasible, in our opinion, to analyze TPs during ARTEMIS. We can monitor cortical dynamics during ARTEMIS application. TP activities or TMS-evoked brain activity changes over time, and we also see some individual patterns which might or could have relevance in a clinical application, in the sense of the personalization of ARTEMIS protocols to check how many passes we need until an effect takes place for a specific patient, for example. And with respect to monitoring cortical excitability or cortical dynamics during ARTEMIS in the clinical context, there's actually one study. It's also the only study I found which analyzed TPs during ARTEMIS. They only focused on the N100. As you can see here, we applied 900 pulses of 1 Hz ARTEMIS over the left primary motor cortex in children with ADHD. And they found, as you can see here, that the N100 amplitude decreased, and that after, so the authors say that after 500 pulses, there's more or less a plateau reached where the effect stays stable, for example. But this is, of course, in a pathological condition, so it's not the healthy brain. So the next steps are to apply more pulses, of course, to see if these trends continue or if they reverse or something. Maybe we will find, or we actually did it. We already repeated the experiment with 2000 pulses under laboratory conditions with the use of neuronavigation and also with our cobot setup. So Mira and Kao are presenting you our cobot setup, and we also used a cobot assisted hotspot search, which we're developing over the course of the Max project together with Desmond. So trying to build up an algorithm to use the cobot to search through a grid to identify and hotspot usage of this technology. So that's all from my side, and thank you for your attention.